Chapter 4 of Uganda's White Man of Work, a story of Alexander M. Mackay. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynn Thompson. Uganda's White Man of Work, a story of Alexander M. Mackay by Sophia, Lyon, FAHS. Chapter 4. Two receptions at the Royal Palace. What of the rest of the brave band who started together from England? A grave to be found on a small island off the coast near Zanzibar told the story of one, and by the shores of Victoria Lake on a wooden slab above a mound of earth could have been read the name Dr. John Smith. Two more of the party had returned to their English homes as invalids, while Mr. Mackay was still cutting, digging, and levelling for the road to Mpwapwa. The other three members of the party that remained were camping beside the far-reaching waters of Victoria Lake. They were Lieutenant Smith, Mr. O'Neill, and Mr. Wilson. To these men, tenting on the lake shore, came two most cordial letters from the king they were so eager to see. Twice canoes appeared before their camps, and guides came from Mutesa to escort them to his kingdom. These letters had been written in English by a black boy named Mufta, who had been educated in a Christian school on the coast and had been left by Mr. Stanley with Mutesa to read the Bible to him. This is a copy of the second royal letter. To my dear friend, I send this my servant that you may come quickly, and therefore I pray you come to me quickly, and let not this my servant come without you, and send my salam to the king. This from me, Mutesa, king of Uganda. With so urgent an appeal from the king himself, little wonder it is that two of the white men, leaving Mr. O'Neill to guard their supplies and to repair the steam launch, hastened alone to the northern shore of the lake. It was about an hour from sunset on a June day in 1877 when their boats were anchored off a little Uganda village at the head of a beautiful bay. Here they were left by their guides, who went to the king to announce the coming of the white men. Soon some of Mutesa's chief men arrived to say that they must come to his palace with the escort the king had sent. A most interesting walk it was to the capital city, taking all of 2 days. Plantain groves covered thousands of acres of hillsides. Here the missionaries found themselves in a great tropical park, where through the branches of the trees glimpses of the beautiful lake could be had. There they wound their way through the thick forest, where the tall trees were heavily festooned with tropical vines of rare beauty. Again they stopped to rest by a cool, clear stream in the midst of a valley abounding in ferns and palms. On the march once more, they crossed a broad swamp by way of a log road. At last Rubaga, the capital city, was reached, where they were shown to the huts made ready for them by the king's order. The first day the king paid his respects by sending a rich present of cooking utensils, plantains, potatoes, sugar cane, milk, pombe, venison, and firewood. Promptly at 8 o'clock the following morning, two of the chief officers of the king came to escort them to the palace. These officers were superbly costumed in garbs modelled after the Arab style. Their white trousers, tunics, and stockings were beautifully set off by red shoes and caps. As the missionaries climbed the hill leading to the palace, they were escorted by several soldiers dressed in white, each carrying a flintlock musket. Behind them paraded a crowd of Waganda, dressed for the most part in long, loose brown gowns made from fig-tree bark. Altogether the officers, the soldiers, the white men, and the crowd in long procession made a sight that was picturesque indeed. The broad straight road which led up to the royal hill, superb in itself, was made especially imposing by the tall fence of tiger grass enclosing it on either side. To build these fences, posts 10 or 12 feet in height were driven into the ground at intervals of a few yards. In and out were then woven long, thick, horizontal ropes of reed-like grass stalks. Finally, to make the meshes closer, there were tied to the fence many vertical stalks of the same kind of grass. Fences such as this lined all the important roads in Uganda, and were used also to enclose the private yards about the huts. At the top of the hill stood Mutesa's palace, a building 40 feet in height and supported on each side by straight wooden pillars. The graceful yellow stems of tiger grass formed its walls, and its roof, too, was thatched with grass. With its 70 feet of length, the structure was easily the largest in the realm. To the front of the palace were a number of courts separated from one another by high grass fences, with sliding doors of grass connecting them. As the white men neared the royal enclosure, a bugle announced their coming. The gates of the courts were opened one by one as the party approached, and quickly closed behind them as they passed. 2 lines of white-robed soldiers made a lane through each court, each soldier carrying a gun. As the last gate opened and closed, Lieutenant Smith and Mr. Wilson found themselves before the open door of the palace itself. In the central hall, on stools ranged in 2 rows on either side of the entrance, sat all the chiefs of the country. Some were dressed in black, some were in white, and some in red, but all the costumes were of Arabian pattern. All the chiefs arose as the white men entered. The guests were conducted to the upper end of the hall, where on a chair of white wood sat His Majesty, King Mutesa. The king was wearing a black Arab tunic trimmed with gold braid. His trousers and stockings were white, and his cap and shoes were red. In his belt he carried a richly mounted sword. At his feet lay a small rug, while the rest of the hall was carpeted with grass. As the Englishmen approached, Mutesa arose from his throne, shook hands with them, and then by a wave of the hand directed them to 2 stools near him which had been reserved for them. Forthwith there was much beating of drums. 5 minutes of noise gave an opportunity for all in the room to feast their eyes on the central figures of this reception at court. When the drums had finished their din, the king called one of the messengers whom he had sent to bring the white men to Uganda. He bade him tell the story of their adventures. Letters were then read from the Sultan of Zanzibar and from the Church Missionary Society in London. The English of the letter from England was translated for the king by Mufta. This was the way it read: "To His Majesty King Mutesa, ruler of Uganda. Sire, we have heard with pleasure, through our friend Mr. Stanley, of your earnest invitation to English teachers to come and settle in your kingdom, promising them your favor and protection. The greatness of England, of which you have heard, is due to the word of God, which we possess. Her laws are framed in accordance with it. Her people are made happy by it. Our desire is that your throne should be made secure, your country be made great, and your people made happy by the same means. We have resolved, therefore, by the help of God, to send to you 2 or 3 of our friends who will be prepared to settle among your people and to teach them the word of God and other knowledge which will be useful. From what Mr. Stanley has told us, we are sure you will give them a warm welcome when they arrive, and treat them kindly and take care that they want nothing. Commending you to the grace and blessing of the Most High God, who is King of kings and Lord of lords, and whose servants we are, we desire to subscribe ourselves your Majesty's friends and well-wishers." In the midst of the reading of the letter, the king ordered the firing of a salute, and a general rejoicing to be made, and at the close of the reading the expressions of gladness seemed to have no bounds. The king, half rising from his chair, called his chief musician and ordered a more vigorous rejoicing. Drums were beaten, horns were blown, and all the assembly of chiefs were bowing their heads and clapping their hands, and saying again and again, "Nyanzig, Nyanzig," we thank you, we thank you. The king asked his interpreter to tell the white men that what they saw and heard was all for the name of Jesus. After some conversation, the white men presented their gifts to the king. These included a Turkish rug, a map of Africa, photographs, and other articles. Lieutenant Smith apologized for the small number of things they had to give, saying that some had been stolen from them on the way. To this the king graciously replied, "Great rivers swallow up small ones." Now I have seen your faces, I do not look on the presents." The next morning the missionaries had a second conversation with the king in the presence of all his chiefs and courtiers. For some reason Mutesa seemed suspicious of them and began to inquire about General Gordon of the English army in Egypt. He wanted the white men to make guns and gunpowder, at the same time confessing, "My heart is not good." The missionaries told him that they had to do as the letter said, and not to make guns, and that if he did not wish them to stay, they would have to leave Uganda. For some time he was silent, then asked, "What have you come for? To teach my people to read and write?" "Yes," they replied, "and whatever useful arts we and those coming may know." Then calling his interpreter, the king said, "Tell them now my heart is good. England is my friend. I have one hand in Uganda and the other in England." When the missionaries reached their huts after the morning baraza (court) was over, there came to them a messenger from Mutesa, saying that there was one more word which he wanted to say to them, but he had been afraid to say it before all the people. Eager to know what this further message was, Lieutenant Smith and Mr. Wilson in the afternoon went a third time to the king's palace. They found him seated in a side room, with only a few chiefs and one wife present. He said, "There is one word I want to say to you. I was afraid to speak it this morning because the Arabs were present. This is it. Did you bring the book? That is all I want." They told him they had it in English and Arabic, and part of it in the language spoken at the coast, which Mutesa knew slightly, and they hoped soon to give it to him in Luganda, the language of Uganda. Then Mutesa's heart was very good. He took the white men out into his palace grounds and showed them the beautiful views which could be had from various positions. He also pointed out 2 sites which he said he would give them, one for a mission house, the other for a school. "When will they be built?" they asked. "Tomorrow my people shall go and bring wood," and the king was as good as his word, for the next day the work began. Such a welcome was most encouraging. After a month's stay in the hut Mutesa had built for them, Lieutenant Smith said good bye to Mr. Wilson and started for the southern end of the lake to tell Mr. O'Neill how royally Mutesa had received them. He expected to help Mr. O'Neill launch the missionary boat and pack supplies. Then together they would return to Uganda. But their hopes were never realized. While on one of the islands in the southern part of the lake, both Mr. Smith and Mr. O'Neill were heartlessly murdered by the natives. The terrible news was reported to Mr. Mackay before his oxen and carts had reached Mpwapwa. His cattle had been dying 3 and 4 a day. The dusky natives were daily jeering at the white man's failure. He himself had just recovered from another attack of fever. Just at that moment he heard that 2 more of their band had been taken from them. Broken hearted, yet believing in his God, he wrote to a friend at home, "Our good doctor, my own dear friend of many years, went to his rest 9 months ago, and now these brave brothers, Smith and O'Neill, have fallen. There were 8 of us sent out, 2 invalided, and 4 gone home, only 2 remaining. Poor Africa! When will it become a Christian country at this rate? But God has other hands in reserve, whom he will bring to the front, fast and unexpectedly, and the work will go on, whether we break down or not." Since a wealthy Arab merchant had been murdered along with the missionaries, Mr. Mackay was afraid that the Arabs would take revenge on the king who had murdered them. Eager to prevent further bloodshed, he decided to hurry to the lake as fast as possible. Bundles and bags were safely stored, and Mr. Tytherleigh was left to see that the best 2 of the carts, emptied of all freight, were dragged to Mpwapwa. Mackay himself sped forward as fast as possible. 5 days of quick marching, wading and swimming through jungles, swamps and rivers brought him to Mpwapwa. A brief rest, and he was again on the forced march, with only 6 men to carry outfit, food, and medicine. Although hurrying as fast as he was able, he saw 3 months go by before he reached Kaggai, a little town on the southern shore of Victoria Lake. The body of his only white companion, Mr. Tytherleigh, was laid in a grave by the way. Mr. Mackay tramped through jungles, plodded along sandy deserts, and picked his way over stony stretches till his feet were blistered and bleeding. Every step was painful. Repeated attacks of fever reduced him almost to a skeleton, but on the evening of the 13th of June, forgetting his weakness and pain, with intense joy he stood on the shore of Victoria Lake. At last his miserable marching was over, and he too could hope soon to present himself at the court of King Mutesa. June passed, and July, and August. Indeed, it was not until November 1878 that Mr. Mackay entered the capital of Uganda. 2 years and a half had passed since he had said good-bye to his friends in the homeland, 2 years and a half spent merely in travelling, and he had not yet even seen the king who had asked Stanley to send him missionaries. But Mutesa had not forgotten his request. For over a year Mr. Wilson had lived near his palace, and the black king had learned to like him. Mr. Wilson had told His Majesty of the other white man who was on his way, and Mutesa grew very eager to receive Mr. Mackay. But the day he arrived the king was ill. He merely sent his salams and 2 fat goats. 2 days later, however, word came that the king was holding baraza, and wished to see Mr. Wilson and Mr. Mackay at once. Carrying their presents with them, they started off for the palace. Mr. Mackay will tell his own story of their reception. "Messenger after messenger came running like madmen to hurry us on, but I was determined not to give way to the frantic behaviour of these excited couriers, and kept a steady step. At length we entered on the grand esplanade, running east and west along the top of the hill and ending in the palace at the west end. The gates were opened, the grand guard presented arms, and we passed along through the double row of guards into a large hall densely lined with courtiers. At the far end was a door through which we were ushered into the presence of the king. Here he was, seated on a mat, dressed in a long white robe and long black coat richly embroidered with gold braid. He bowed politely, and stools were brought for us to sit on, while some Turkish-dressed attendants squatted on the ground. An old woman sat behind the king, a little way off, and watched intently. For 10 minutes we eyed each other in dead silence. Then a little talk began. Our gifts were presented, and the music-box struck up the fine air. The heavens are telling, from Haydn's oratorio called Creation. We talked with him on many subjects for an hour. The king told us he had been led to suspect the coming of Englishmen to his country as a danger to his throne. But now a year had passed since Lieutenant Smith and Mr. Wilson first arrived, and all his intercourse with our party had only tended to raise us in his favour. After some time the king intimated that he was too ill to sit long, and gave us permission to go. We left, the whole court rising and following us down the hill, small boys, as usual, forming a majority of the spectators and followers. In the evening the king sent us no less than 10 fat cattle as a present, and a man's load of tobacco, with a like quantity of both coffee and honey." This, then, was the sort of reception given by King Mutesa to the first English missionaries of Uganda. He showed every sign of being glad to have them in his country. He supplied them generously with food. He gave them huts to live in. He built them a mission house and school building. At court he listened attentively to their messages. He observed the Christian Sabbath, and welcomed Christian services at his court. Every prospect was encouraging, and with gratitude the missionaries carried on their work. Chapter 5